The first time they found remains, the officers thought it was a bear attack. That's the go-to explanation out here. But even then, something didn't fit. The bite radius was too wide, the depth too shallow, and the way the bones were arranged, deliberate, almost patterned. It wasn't like any animal kill they'd seen before. The body hadn't been eaten for nourishment. It had been sampled. Flesh stripped from certain areas, organs left untouched, like something was testing. Locals said the disappearances began right after the flood, when the levee broke and the lowlands filled with stagnant water. Whole colonies of animals were displaced, or that's what we were told. But what they don't mention is what came up from the ground when the water receded. The ranger who filed that first report quit 3 days later. He left a voicemail that night saying he heard something out by the marsh, something that mimicked his own voice, calling his name from the dark. That recording was never released, but a copy surfaced years later, and the sound at the end, it wasn't human. Now, 3 counties across have gone on unofficial lockdown. No public warnings, no statements. Just roads quietly closing after dusk. And the thing is, the pattern of these disappearances follows the rivers. Always downstream, always near settlements. Which means they're not just hunting anymore. They've learned the scent of us, the taste of us, and for the first time in recorded history, they're multiplying. If you think this is another wild animal story, you haven't been paying attention. The first official reports came out of the southern wetlands, a stretch of forgotten land where the rivers braid into each other, and locals joke that the ground itself moves. Most of the people who live there have been around water their whole lives, hunters, shrimpers, park rangers. They know what's natural and what's not. It started small. A dog missing here, a few cattle there. The sheriff's office dismissed it as coyotes or feral hogs, but the locals kept saying the same thing. They'd hear something breathing near the edge of the tree line, see ripples in water where nothing should be moving. Whatever it was learning their routines. By late summer, 3 separate families reported missing relatives along the same 10-mile stretch of river. The search teams found traces of blood, shredded clothing, and drag marks that disappeared right into the water. The mud around the prints was disturbed, but not in any recognizable pattern, as if something moved with no weight, no rhythm. One ranger described it like watching a shadow decide to stand up. His partner wrote that down. The shadow stood up in the official incident log. That entry was later removed. The State Wildlife Division quietly shut down the area for environmental restoration. Locals weren't fooled. They said new patrols started coming through at night, unmarked trucks, high-beam lights, people in respirators walking the swamps with motion scanners. When questioned, one of those contractors said something that stuck with me. He said, and I quote, "We're not trapping them, we're counting them." Then he stopped talking altogether. That was 4 years ago. Since then, the same reports have spread north, Arkansas, Mississippi, Alabama. Always near rivers, always where people live close to the water. And if you plot those reports on a map, it forms a clear direction. Upstream. It was September 12, 2020, 2 years after the first disappearances. The case that broke the silence took place 40 miles north of Monticello, Arkansas, near a stretch of the Saline River the locals called Dead Water. The nickname didn't come from folklore. It came from how fast things rot there. Fish, vegetation, even metal. The water's chemical balance kills almost anything that stays submerged too long. That morning, 2 brothers, Dale and Morgan Reese, took their boat out before sunrise. They were both experienced hunters, 3rd-generation swamp guides. Around 9:30 a.m., they radioed a friend that they'd seen movement on the bank. The friend said they sounded off, like they were whispering. The call ended abruptly, but not with panic, more like confusion. By evening, when they hadn't returned, the sheriff's department launched a small search party. They found the boat the next day, about a mile downstream. The engine was running. The propeller was bent inward, not broken by impact, but crushed, as if something had gripped it from behind. Inside the boat, there were no signs of a struggle, no blood, no gunshot residue. Just two rifles laid side by side, safety still on, and a cooler of untouched food. But the anchor rope was gone. The hook was still attached. The line led straight into the black water and disappeared. When divers finally went down, visibility was near zero. Silt, algae, and debris made the water thick like ink. They didn't find the brothers that day. What they did find was the anchor line, tied to something roughly the size of a refrigerator, buried in the mud. It had claw marks, deep, human-like indentations, and strands of coarse, pale tissue embedded in the rope. The tissue samples were sent to a private lab in Little Rock. That lab reported back within 48 hours, requesting an in-person meeting with the county coroner. Then, suddenly, the file was locked under state jurisdiction. Every copy of the autopsy photo was deleted from local servers the next morning. One of the deputies who helped with the dive left town a week later. His wife later told reporters he hadn't been the same since. He'd wake up drenched in sweat, saying he heard gurgling beneath the floorboards. The house wasn't near water. No one ever found the Reese brothers. But 3 weeks later, a trail camera half a mile from the site captured something moving through the cattails, low to the ground, hairless, with shoulders broader than a man's, and a face that turned toward the lens before it disappeared into the dark. That image was dismissed as a trick of light, but the sheriff who reviewed it retired that same month, and when asked if he thought it was a hoax, he just said, "If it was a trick, it was looking right at me." When the tissue samples from the Saline River case quietly resurfaced months later, they didn't go to a government lab. They ended up in the hands of a retired wildlife biologist named Dr. Ernest Clymer, a man who'd spent 30 years studying predator behavior in collapsing ecosystems. He wasn't supposed to talk about what he found, but a transcript from a 2021 podcast leak revealed fragments of his notes. He described the cells as belonging to something that shouldn't be able to exist here, a hybrid between terrestrial and aquatic carnivores. The structure of the muscle fibers suggested fast twitch development, meaning this thing could move both in water and on land without fatigue. But what disturbed him most was the cellular density. Tissue designed to absorb oxygen even when submerged. That's not evolution over centuries. That's recent adaptation. According to Clymer, the key might have been the floods. When the levees broke in 2018, underground runoff merged with toxic waste dumps and animal burial sites, a mix that carried both decayed tissue and living bacteria. Some scientists call it cross-species transfer potential, a rare mutation when organic material fuses under anaerobic conditions. In simple terms, the swamp built something new. That theory didn't sit well with local officials, but it did with biologists who'd been tracking sudden behavioral changes in river predators, garfish attacking humans, nutria abandoning burrows, otters turning aggressive in pairs. It was as if the entire food chain below had changed its diet at once. Dr. Clymer later compared the phenomenon to historical records from the Tsavo River in Kenya, where two lions in 1898 developed a taste for human flesh. But the difference, he said, was scale. The Tsavo lions were isolated anomalies. This, whatever it was, showed reproductive clustering, meaning there weren't just a few, there was a population. Another researcher, unnamed in the transcript, claimed that under thermal imaging, these creatures emit inconsistent heat signatures. Parts of the body read colder than the surrounding air. That only happens in species with mixed blood adaptation: reptiles, amphibians, deep-sea predators. His exact words were, "They're not evolving toward us, they're evolving around us." Experts propose that, driven by dwindling prey and rising temperatures, these scavengers began experimenting with new protein sources, carrion, livestock, and eventually, human remains. The problem? Once a predator finds a consistent, calorie-dense food source, it doesn't stop. It adapts to hunt for more. That's when the theory stopped being scientific and started being terrifying. Because if they've adapted to feed on us and survive on land long enough to reproduce, then containment isn't possible. We're not looking at an animal outbreak anymore. We're looking at a species that just found its ecological niche, and we happen to live in it. It didn't stay confined to that one clearing. By the following week, reports started pouring in from hunters, hikers, and even park rangers stationed miles apart. Each described the same thing, a sound that didn't fit any animal native to those mountains. It was guttural, almost human, but stretched out in a way that felt wrong, as if something was trying to imitate a voice it didn't understand. At first, people thought it was an echo. The valley sometimes carried noises for miles, but when the same sound was recorded simultaneously from two distant ridges, that theory collapsed. Whatever was out there, it wasn't bound to one place. It moved, fast, and it was watching. The first disappearance after the initial encounter happened near Cades Cove. A father and son were setting up a hunting blind when the forest went silent. Not in the usual predator nearby kind of way. It was total. The boy described it later as if the world muted itself. Minutes later, his father was gone. No dragging marks, no sign of a struggle, just a dropped rifle and the faint smell of copper in the air. The boy's testimony was dismissed at first. Shock, they said. But 2 days later, park rangers on night patrol saw movement between the trees. Tall, pale. It didn't run, it glided, inhumanly smooth, almost like it wasn't bound by the terrain. And when they shone their flashlights, it froze mid-motion, mimicking their own stance. Then came the recordings. Amateur campers who thought they were hearing coyotes screaming at dusk soon realized the cries were too patterned. Each wail seemed to answer the other. One from the North Ridge, another echoing seconds later from the south. Locals began locking their doors earlier. Visitors canceled trips. Even the tourists who did show up talked about the feeling of being followed, like something was pacing them just out of sight. By mid-month, Forest Service dispatches were being flooded. Dogs refused to track. Trail cameras malfunctioned. Batteries died without reason. And somewhere deep in the Smokies, near the old ranger outpost that hadn't been manned in decades, a single motion-triggered camera captured 3 still frames. Something tall, blurred, crouched low to the ground. The outline wasn't animal. It wasn't human either. The spread was no longer speculation. It was undeniable. Something had come down from the mist, and it wasn't leaving. The official investigation began quietly. No press releases, no ranger briefings, nothing that would alarm the public. But in the small towns along the park's edge, word travels faster than any government memo. Locals noticed unmarked SUVs at trailheads, men with clipped hair and field equipment combing through the trees at dawn. No patches, no insignias, just the faint hum of handheld devices that clicked whenever they got close to something metallic in the soil. By late August, what had been treated as folklore was suddenly drawing attention from agencies that had no business being there. The Forest Service reports were scrubbed of details. Case numbers disappeared from the public log. Even the families of those missing received new visitors. Polite, calm, but insistent, asking them not to talk to anyone about unverified wilderness phenomena. Rangers still in the field told stories off the record. One said his compass spun every time he got near an old stone foundation deep in the woods, a remnant of a settlement that predated the park itself. Another claimed to have seen lights under the ground, faint, bluish pulses, like fireflies trapped beneath the dirt. Then came the recordings. A retired ranger named Harlan Brooks turned in an old cassette found inside an abandoned trail shack near Klingman's Dome. The tape was dated 1977. The voice on it was calm, deliberate. describing sightings that matched perfectly with what was happening now. The man on the tape mentioned mimics, creatures that copy the voices of the lost to lure the living deeper into the woods. He ended the recording with a line that still chills anyone who's heard it. If you hear your own name whispered from the mist, run. It's never the one calling you. Within a week of that tape's discovery, Harlan disappeared. His truck was found idling at the park's boundary line, headlights still on, door open. Investigators stopped sharing updates after that. The forest was declared under observation, a polite term that meant off limits. Helicopters started doing silent passes at night. No searchlights, just slow, sweeping movements above the canopy. Locals said they saw figures moving in the mist beneath those flights, something long-armed and fast enough to vanish between flashes of lightning. The deeper they looked, the more the investigation unraveled. Every trail camera near the affected zone failed within 24 hours. Satellite imaging showed static interference over that same area. Even weather stations reported unexplained temperature drops, sudden, localized freezes that vanished as quickly as they came. It wasn't just a creature anymore. It was a presence, one that didn't want to be found. By the time the first survivors were found, it was clear the forest had become something else entirely. One of them, a hunter named Victor Lang, described entering the woods for a weekend trip, only to realize hours later that every tree, every boulder, every familiar marker had shifted. He didn't walk in circles. The forest itself seemed to rearrange around him. Victor said he heard voices calling his name, faint at first, then louder, mimicking his mother, his brother, even his own voice from the morning before. He said he ran, but each path led him back to the same clearing. By the time he stumbled onto a ridge, he noticed the water running upstream, bending against the current, impossible. Something in the forest didn't obey natural law. Another survivor, a young hiker named Elise Martin, told a story that was even harder to reconcile. She said she was following a trail cam's motion detection lights to locate a deer when she realized the same figure had been watching her for hours. She described it as hairless, pale, and moving almost too quickly for the human eye to track. And then, it crouched and imitated her dog's bark. When she turned, the dog was gone. Medical reports noted her heightened stress levels, her heart rate, adrenaline spikes, and yet, no signs of physical attack. It was psychological hunting, trauma designed to break the mind before the body. Experts later called it a form of adaptive predatory behavior, something akin to what dolphins do when hunting schools of fish, but scaled for humans. These accounts weren't isolated. Within weeks, similar reports came from multiple counties. Hunters, campers, even Forest Service personnel reported being stalked. Dogs refused to follow scents. GPS trackers failed. Vehicles stalled inexplicably along forest roads. And the creatures, whatever they were, seemed to understand human behavior. They adapted, predicted movements, learned patterns. By the time authorities accepted the pattern, containment was no longer possible. What started as isolated incidents had escalated into a sprawling network of sightings, disappearances, and inexplicable events. The survivors' accounts painted a forest alive with intention, one that hunted, mimicked, and multiplied. And if you step into those woods now, you aren't entering a forest. You're entering a living track. Experts who've studied the accounts and the limited evidence propose a chilling possibility. These creatures aren't just scavengers. They're rapidly adapting predators, a product of environmental stress, human interference, and biological mutation. One hypothesis points to the massive floods and chemical runoff in the southern rivers. The water carried nutrients, bacteria, and decayed tissue, creating a perfect storm for cross-species mutation. Dr. Ernest Clymer, a retired wildlife biologist, called it rapid adaptive predation. In simple terms, a species exposed to extreme conditions can undergo accelerated biological changes, not over centuries, but in a matter of a few generations. He described tissue samples showing a combination of traits seen in both terrestrial and aquatic predators. Muscles built for speed, lungs and gills capable of extracting oxygen in both air and water, and a skeletal structure allowing upright movement, bipedal enough to stalk humans efficiently. Another theory suggests behavioral mimicry plays a role. Historical studies on apex predators, from wolves to crows, show they can learn patterns quickly, sometimes copying other species to gain advantage. Applied to these creatures, mimicry could explain the reported ability to imitate voices, including those of their victims, to lure prey into vulnerable positions. Clymer compared it to the infamous Tsavo man-eaters of Kenya in 1898. Those lions developed a taste for humans under unusual ecological pressures, prey scarcity and proximity to settlements. The difference here is scale. Whatever these creatures are, they've not only learned to target humans, they've also reproduced rapidly. There's evidence of clustering, suggesting population growth rather than isolated incidents. Some ecologists point to an evolutionary mechanism called predatory plasticity, a species' ability to expand its diet and hunting methods in real time. Combine that with human encroachment, the disappearance of natural prey, and changing climates, and you get a predator that is not only surviving, but thriving because it preys on humans. In short, the swamp didn't just create these creatures. We may have helped. Through ecological disruption, pollution, and displacement, we offered the perfect conditions for something dangerous, intelligent, and adaptive to emerge. Something that sees humans as both food and opportunity. As of now, the phenomenon shows no signs of slowing. Reports continue to come in from counties across Arkansas, Mississippi, and Louisiana. Entire stretches of forest have been closed to the public under the guise of environmental protection, but locals know the truth. People aren't allowed because something hunts in those trees. Trail cameras capture only fleeting glimpses, shadowed figures, humanoid silhouettes crouched low, vanishing into the undergrowth. GPS trackers and even drones fail near the heart of the affected zones. Electronics malfunction, compasses spin, and cell service drops in the most inexplicable ways. Fishermen have reported hearing what they describe as a human laugh carried across the water at 3 a.m., followed by the disappearance of their boat's anchors, sometimes even motors. Hikers have gone missing in pairs, leaving behind shoes, backpacks, or ropes untouched, all pointing to a predator that doesn't just kill, but experiments, learns, and stalks with calculated patience. Even more chilling, towns along the river have reported strange patterns. Livestock mutilated in precise ways, dogs disappearing without a trace, and faint footprints leading into dense marshes where no human could survive unaided. Scientists reviewing these cases note the adaptive intelligence. This isn't mindless aggression, it's strategic hunting behavior. The creatures appear to be multiplying. Witnesses report seeing groups, sometimes as many as 6 or 7 moving in tandem, spreading through the forest corridors. Thermal readings suggest rapid population growth, with young fully mobile and capable of independent hunting. This isn't a single anomaly anymore. It's an expanding threat. A predator network learning to live, a predator to live alongside humans without being detected. Authorities remain largely silent. Public awareness is limited, but the evidence is clear. What began as a series of strange incidents in remote wetlands has now grown into a persistent, adaptive, and deadly presence. And anyone venturing into those forests tonight is stepping into territory controlled by something that has learned the taste of humans, and it's only getting hungrier.